Welcome to the Facilitators Deep Dive podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery. We're going to be looking at storytelling.
Ooh, fun.
Yeah. So we're cracking open how to tell a story, The Secrets of Writing Captivating Narratives.
Oh, yeah.
By Peter Ruby and Gary Provost.
It's a classic.
Yeah. You're looking to, I'm assuming you're listening to this because you want to level up your story sense, right?
Right.
So get ready because we're going to unpack what makes a story captivating and how you can get that magic yourself.
It's a really great book for getting down to the like nuts and bolts of good storytelling.
And we're talking about figuring out which story ideas are even worth pursuing.
Yes.
And then like what framework makes a story work. We're even going to learn why saying yes all the time can make for a boring story.
It's true.
And we'll uncover a pretty simple model of dramatic structure.
Oh, yeah.
That applies to like almost all stories out there.
Yeah, like the vast majority. It's crazy.
That's right. So I know sometimes the hardest part is like even knowing where to begin.
Yeah.
And they start off strong, Ruby and Provost do, by emphasizing the power of a good story idea. So let's unpack this a little bit.
Yeah.
They say it needs to resonate with the reader.
Yes.
Not just the writer.
Not just you.
Right. Not just me.
Yeah.
So it's not enough for it to be familiar or important or true to you as the author.
Right.
They actually have a fit test for bad ideas.
Oh, I love this.
Based on those three things: familiarity, importance, and truth.
Yeah.
It's like a gut check to make sure you're not just writing for yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
So like if I were to write a story about my cat Mittens who learned to fetch,
Okay.
it might be true
Uh-huh.
and important to me.
Yeah.
But would anyone else be hooked?
Probably not. Unless Mittens was, like, solving crimes or something.
Right.
The point is it's about, like, tapping into universal experiences
Yes.
and emotions that all readers can connect with.
Okay.
So think about, like, those classic moral dilemmas, like, really get your heart pounding. Yeah.
And make you question what you would do.
So big emotional stakes
Yes, exactly.
are key.
Absolutely.
And that brings us to genres. Now, you might think of them as simple categories.
Yeah.
But Ruby and Provost argue that they're actually more like blueprints.
Blueprints.
Yeah. So think of it this way.
Okay.
Each genre has certain guidelines and expectations for the writer and the reader.
Right.
So understanding your genre is crucial.
Yeah.
And in the book, they break down all sorts of genres: romance, thrillers, science fiction, fantasy, literary fiction, you name it. It's interesting because they even talk about how Gary Provost himself, Mr. Writing Guru,
I know, right?
actually wrote a romance novel under a pseudonym.
Wild.
Which just goes to show that a deep understanding of storytelling can apply to, well, any genre. Like, even if you're writing a romance novel, you still need compelling ethical dilemmas, high stakes, and of course a powerful hook to keep your reader engaged.
Absolutely. Speaking of hooks, how do we make sure our story grabs the reader from the very first page?
They stress that a strong hook involves those compelling dilemmas we talked about.
Yeah.
And characters facing extreme circumstances that elicits strong emotional responses.
Yeah.
Like, would you save your loved one or 100 strangers?
Ooh.
You know, those kinds of questions.
Get you thinking.
Get the reader thinking and invested right away.
Yeah. So tapping into those big, like, universal questions.
Exactly.
And what about keeping up that momentum throughout the whole story?
Well, they talk about Stephen King's concept of get out of that storytelling, especially in thrillers.
Right.
It's that constant sense of danger,
Yeah.
where the protagonist is always kind of in a tight spot and the reader is on the edge of their seat wondering, like, how are they going to escape?
I can see how that would keep you glued to the pages.
Uh-oh.
They also mentioned the ticking clock, right?
Exactly. That's a classic technique for creating urgency and keeping those pages turning.
Now, before we get into, like, the nitty-gritty of story structure,
Okay.
I'm curious. What's resonating with you so far? What's standing out as particularly relevant to your own writing goals?
Yeah, think about that for a second.
Yeah. Take a moment to think about that because we're about to dive into something that might surprise you.
Okay.
Ruby and Provost present this remarkably simple model that captures the structure of a huge percentage of stories out there. They claim it works for 90% of stories ever told.
Really?
I know. That's
they
amazing.
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing.
Huh.
In just one paragraph.
Okay.
Gary Provost manages to outline a framework that seems to apply to everything from, classic novels to blockbuster movies.
Wow.
Okay, drum roll, please. Here it is. A character has a problem. He decides to do something about it. He runs into opposition, and just as things seem as bad as they could get, he learns an important lesson. And when offered the prize he had sought so strenuously, he has to decide whether or not to take it.
It's so simple.
It really is that simple.
Yeah.
So we've got our character with a goal and a plan.
Mm-hmm.
But then, of course, they encounter obstacles and conflict.
Of course.
Right?
Yeah.
Because stories need that friction, that tension.
Exactly.
To keep us engaged.
Yes.
And as things get tough,
yeah,
the stakes rise, the consequences become more dire.
Right.
And we hit that bleakest moment for our character.
Yeah.
But it's in that darkness
Right.
that they have a revelation,
Yes.
a shift in perspective. And then they have to make a choice.
They do.
A final decision that often comes with difficult trade-offs.
Mm-hmm.
And the best part is, they actually give us concrete examples to illustrate this structure in action.
Oh, cool.
Like what?
Well, they mentioned films like Tootsie,
Okay.
Close Encounters of the Third Kind, The Great Escape, even The Fugitive.
Wow.
All of which follow this basic model.
Pretty cool, huh?
It's really cool.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, like, does this structure apply to every single story? Is there any story out there that breaks this mold?
Good question.
Right.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that while frameworks are helpful,
Yeah.
there's always room for, creative rule breaking.
Mm-hmm.
But before we get ahead of ourselves,
Okay.
let's stick with this model for a bit and see how it applies to the next element of a captivating story. Characters.
Okay, characters.
Okay, so we've got our framework,
Yeah.
we've got our conflict, but now we need someone to experience it all.
Right. Exactly. And Ruby and Provost have a great way of putting it.
Okay.
They say, the story is not what happens. The story is who it happens to.
I love that. So it's not just about stringing together a bunch of events.
Right.
It's about how those events affect the characters, how they shape their journeys.
Yes, exactly.
They even offer an example of like an amateur sleuth who's stuck in a restrictive marriage.
Oh, okay.
If she's constantly being manipulated by the plot,
Yeah.
she'll come across as passive and uninteresting.
Right. Because she's just reacting to things instead of driving the story forward.
Right.
Exactly. But if she's driven by like her own internal goals and desires, even if she's like afraid,
Yeah.
then we have a character we can root for.
Someone with agency.
Yes.
With their own motivations.
Exactly.
That makes sense. And it reminds me of something we touched on earlier.
What's that?
Conflict.
Ah, yes.
Conflict is the engine of any good story.
It is.
And here's a somewhat counterintuitive tip. Saying yes all the time is boring. Yeah, think about it.
Okay.
Conflict arises when someone says no.
Right.
When obstacles are placed in the character's path. And it doesn't have to be like, a knockdown, drag-out fight.
Right.
It can be subtle tension,
Yeah.
disagreement, or even just like a healthy dose of distrust.
It can be little.
So even a subtle no
Yes.
can create that much-needed friction.
Yeah.
They use this hilarious example called the Ted and Patty story to illustrate how a lack of conflict can make a story fall completely flat.
Ted and Patty, what's their deal?
Well, in this story, Ted and Patty are a couple who just agree with each other about everything.
Oh, no.
No drama, no disagreements, no obstacles.
That sounds boring.
We're just agreeable.
I'm already bored.
I know.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of those times when I'm trying to tell a story
Yeah.
and I realize it's just not that interesting
Yeah.
because everyone's getting along too well.
Exactly. It's a great reminder that conflict, even in its subtlest forms, is the lifeblood of drama.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of layers and complexity,
Okay.
let's move on to subplots.
Okay, so subplots.
Yeah?
Are they just side stories?
Oh, they can be so much more.
Or is there more to them?
So much more than just side stories.
Yep.
When done effectively, they can actually enhance the main narrative,
Yeah.
adding depth and emotional resonance.
Okay. So it's not just about throwing in random events.
Right.
There needs to be a connection to the main plot.
Yes. Think of subplots as echoes of the main story. They might explore similar themes,
Okay.
develop parallel conflicts,
Okay.
or even offer a contrasting perspective on the main character's journey.
So they're like mini stories within the larger story, working together to create a richer experience.
Exactly.
But how do we make sure we're not overwhelming the reader with too many subplots?
That's a great question. And it brings us to one of the most important aspects of storytelling, pacing.
Okay, so now we're talking about the rhythm of the story.
Yes.
How fast or slow things unfold. I can already tell this is going to be crucial.
It is. It is. And there's a lot to cover, from scene construction to different pacing techniques like flashbacks.
Oh, yeah?
And narrative summaries.
Sounds like we're just getting started.
We are.
Okay, so we've got these great characters driving our story forward, but what about the actual flow of the narrative? Pacing, right?
Pacing, yeah.
I've definitely read books where it feels like the story just gets bogged down.
Totally.
Like wading through mud.
Yeah, it happens. Happens to the best of us.
But Ruby and Provost offer some good advice on how to keep the story moving at a good clip. One key aspect they emphasize is scene construction.
Yeah.
So how do we make sure each scene is, like, pulling its weight?
Think of it this way. You want to start close to the action.
Okay.
Have a clear goal for the scene and end when that action is resolved. No unnecessary, like, rambling or lingering goodbyes.
So get in late, get out early, kind of like a well-placed punchline.
Exactly. You want each scene to feel like it's propelling the story forward. And within those scenes, you can use various techniques to control the pacing. For example, they talk about flashbacks.
Flashbacks, yeah. Those can be tricky, though. Sometimes flashbacks feel like an interruption to the main story.
They can be, if not handled carefully. Ruby and Provost caution against overusing them. But when used sparingly and with clear transitions, flashbacks can add depth and context to the narrative.
So how do we make sure those flashbacks feel integrated into the story and not just like random detours?
They suggest using what they call bridges, concrete objects or sensory details that link the present moment to the past, something that triggers the memory for the character.
Like if my character is remembering a childhood event, I might start the flashback with the smell of like freshly baked cookies.
Oh, perfect.
Because that was always present in their grandmother's kitchen.
Yes, exactly,
like
exactly. And then when you transition back to the present, you might use that same sensory detail, the smell of cookies fading, to signal the shift. It's a subtle way to create a cohesive feel.
That's really helpful. What other pacing techniques do they suggest?
Well, they talk about narrative summary,
Yeah.
which can be a great way to condense less important events or smooth transitions between scenes. It's like hitting the fast forward button.
But I imagine there's a danger in summarizing too much. We don't want to skim over the good stuff.
You're absolutely right. It's all about finding the right balance between showing and telling.
Yeah.
You know, you want to keep the story moving, but you also want to immerse the reader in those key moments.
Okay, that makes sense. Are there any, like, specific writing techniques they recommend for controlling the pace at a sentence level?
They talk about the power of action sentences, those short, punchy sentences that convey a sense of movement and urgency.
Oh, I love those. They're like little bursts of energy
Yes.
that keep the story propelling forward.
Exactly. And the key is to make sure each action sentence provides new information, advancing the plot or revealing something about the character. So instead of writing, he walked across the room and sat down on the couch, you might write, he stalked across the room and collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands.
Wow, that second sentence packs so much more punch.
I know, right?
We get a sense of his emotional state.
Yes.
It just feels more dynamic.
Exactly.
Now, remember how we talked about stimulus and response earlier? That applies to pacing as well.
Oh, that's right.
So even within a scene, we need to make sure actions and reactions are presented in a logical order.
Right. You want the reader to be able to, like, follow the flow of events without getting confused. Think of it like a chain reaction.
Okay.
Each action triggering the next, building momentum as the scene unfolds.
This is reminding me of those times I read a scene and I just felt completely lost.
Yeah.
Because the sequence of events was all jumbled.
And that's exactly what you want to avoid. They actually have a kind of a funny example in the book where a woman is punched and then throws a lamp.
Oh.
But the order is unclear, leaving the reader scratching their head.
Okay, so clear, logical action is key. Now, before we move on to the nitty-gritty of polishing our stories, I have a question about rewriting.
Okay.
I'll admit, it's not my favorite part of the process.
I think a lot of writers feel that way. But Ruby and Provost really reframe the whole concept of rewriting.
Okay.
They see it not as a chore, but as an essential part of the creative process.
So embracing the messy middle.
Exactly. It's about understanding that the first draft is rarely, perfect.
Right.
The real magic happens in the revision process, where you can refine your ideas, tighten the prose, make sure every element is serving the story.
They talk about being ruthless in editing, right?
Yes.
Cutting out anything that doesn't contribute to the narrative. That can be hard sometimes.
It can be.
But they have this concept of identifying what they call story events, those key moments that move the plot forward.
Yes.
And they encourage us to cut anything that isn't a story event.
Exactly.
So if a scene is beautifully written, but it doesn't actually advance the plot or reveal anything new about the characters,
Got it, go.
it's tough love. But that's the idea. Now, speaking of serving the story, let's talk about a tricky element that often gets in the way of good pacing. Exposition.
Exposition, that necessary evil.
Ah, yes, exposition, that necessary evil.
Right.
We need to provide the reader with background information, but it can be so easy to just bog down the story with too much telling.
Right.
And Ruby and Provost offer some really practical advice on how to handle exposition gracefully. First, they say to only introduce information when it's absolutely necessary.
So, no big info dumps at the beginning of the story.
Exactly. Hold back until the reader needs to know something to understand the scene or the character's actions. And then, whenever possible, weave that exposition into the scene itself.
Oh, yes.
So instead of saying, like, she was a brilliant scientist haunted by a tragic past, I might show her in her lab, surrounded by complex equipment, a photo of a smiling young man tucked away on a shelf.
I love that.
Something like that.
That's perfect. You're showing us her world, hinting at her past, and creating intrigue all at the same time. It's like sneaking vegetables into a delicious meal. Oh, I love that analogy. The reader gets the information they need without even realizing they're being fed exposition.
That's great. But what about those times when you really do need to provide a chunk of information, especially in narrative nonfiction?
They talk about using what they call half scenes, moments that blend exposition with dramatization.
So like a mini flashback.
Exactly. You might have a scene where a character is recounting a past event. But instead of simply summarizing it, you include dialogue, sensory details, maybe even a bit of inner monologue.
So it feels more like we're experiencing the event alongside the character.
Yes.
Rather than just being told about it.
Precisely.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's circle back to those action sentences we talked about earlier.
Oh, yeah.
They really are the building blocks of a well-paced story.
They are.
So even small actions can be important.
Absolutely. Ruby and Provost stress that even seemingly insignificant actions can be significant if they reveal something about the character or move the plot forward in some way.
Okay, so every detail should be purposeful. And what about the overall structure of the story? How does that play into pacing?
That's a great question. Ruby and Provost argue that a well-paced story isn't just about how fast or slow individual scenes unfold. It's also about the overall architecture of the narrative.
So it's thinking about the big picture.
Exactly. They use this interesting analogy of a coil, suggesting that a good story spirals forward, revisiting earlier themes and motifs in new and unexpected ways.
It's like a tapestry with all these different threads weaving together to create like a rich and intricate pattern.
That's a great way to put it. And they also highlight the power of lateral thinking when it comes to crafting plot twists. It's not just about like shocking the reader, but about creating twists that feel both surprising and inevitable in hindsight.
Okay, so twists that make sense within the logic of the story.
Yes.
But still take us by surprise.
Exactly.
That's a cool concept. Now, before we move on to the final section of our deep dive, I want to pause for a moment and ask you, what are your biggest takeaways from our discussion on pacing? What's resonating with you the most?
Yeah, take a moment to think about that. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. And it's always helpful to pause and reflect on what we've learned.
It is.
And while you do that, we're going to get ready to dive into the final leg of our journey.
Okay.
Where we'll explore some practical advice for turning those raw story ideas into polished manuscripts. Are you ready to tackle the nitty-gritty of the writing process?
I am.
Okay, I'm feeling energized, ready to get those words on the page. So we've got our blueprint, right? We've got compelling characters, a grasp on pacing, but where do we go from here?
Right.
Like, how do we actually take that raw idea and turn it into like a fully fleshed out manuscript?
Well, luckily for us, Ruby and Provost don't just leave us hanging with all these concepts. They lay out this really helpful, like, 14-step process for developing and structuring your story.
14 steps. That sounds a little daunting, but also kind of exciting.
It's a lot, yeah.
Like, we have a roadmap.
Yeah.
Where do you start?
So step 1, write a detailed synopsis.
Okay.
And we're not talking about like a 1-paragraph summary here.
Right.
They recommend at least 2 pages,
Wow.
outlining the beginning, middle, and end of your story.
So it's like creating a mini version of the book.
Yes.
Before we actually write the book.
Exactly. It's all about getting that big picture view.
Okay.
And making sure the overall arc of your story is compelling and makes sense.
And once we have that synopsis nailed down, what's next?
Then they suggest creating a master plot list for your main character.
So it's like a character profile, but with a focus on their journey through the story.
Yes. And here's a cool tip. Do the same thing for all your important characters, not just the protagonist.
That makes sense. It ensures that like every character is pulling their weight, contributing to the overall story. It reminds me of that Chekhov quote.
Yeah.
If you say in the first chapter that there's a rifle hanging on the wall, in the second or third chapter, it absolutely must go off.
I love that.
Right. Like
Yeah.
every element should have a purpose.
Exactly. No wasted characters, no extraneous subplots. Everything should be working in harmony.
Okay, so we have our synopsis, our master plot lists. What other prep work do they recommend?
Well, before you dive into writing scenes, they suggest taking some time to flesh out your characters' backstories.
So understanding their past, their motivations, what makes them tick.
Exactly. Even if you don't explicitly reveal all this backstory in the story itself, having a solid understanding of your characters' pasts will inform the choices they make and make them feel more real.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So we've done all this character work. We've got a good sense of the overall plot. Are we finally ready to start writing those scenes?
Almost. They have one more really practical tip. For plotting out your story, they recommend using index cards to represent each scene.
Oh, I love that idea. It's so visual.
Right. You can write a brief description of each scene on a card, including the key elements like the goal, the conflict, and the resolution. And then you can literally rearrange those cards. Experiment with different sequences and see how the story flows.
It's like a hands-on approach to plotting, allowing you to play around with different possibilities before you commit to anything.
Exactly. It's a great way to see the big picture and make sure the pacing feels right. And speaking of pacing, they have some very specific advice about that crucial opening scene.
The hook. We talked about that earlier.
Yes.
It has to grab the reader's attention, make them want to keep reading.
Right. They say that the opening scene should be like the most compelling scene you can possibly write.
No pressure, right.
Yeah.
But I understand what they mean. That first impression is everything.
Absolutely. And once you've got that killer opening scene, they recommend using a technique called stepping stones to map out the rest of the story.
Stepping stones, what are those?
They're essentially key scenes or events that act as markers along your character's journey. Think of them as the big plot points, the turning points that propel the story forward.
So they're like the pillars that hold up the entire structure of the story.
Exactly. By identifying those stepping stones early on, you can make sure you're hitting those crucial moments and that the pacing feels balanced and satisfying.
This is all great stuff. I'm already starting to feel more confident about tackling my next project.
That's what we like to hear. And there's even more practical advice in the book.
Oh, good.
For example, they stress the importance of writing every day, even if it's just a page or 2.
Consistency is key, right?
Yes.
It's like building a muscle. The more you write, the easier it becomes.
They also offer some really helpful advice for overcoming writer's block, which is something every writer struggles with at some point.
Oh, tell me about it. What do they suggest?
One technique they recommend is visualization. Before you start writing a scene, take some time to picture it in your mind. Imagine the setting, the characters, the emotions. It's like having a movie playing in your head.
And then you just try to capture that movie on the page.
Exactly. And they also remind us that writing is about thinking. It's about working through your ideas on the page and figuring out what you want to say.
Okay, so far we've been talking a lot about fiction writing. But what about those of us who are interested in crafting narrative nonfiction? Does this advice still apply?
It absolutely does. And in fact, Ruby and Provost dedicate a whole section of the book to the art of writing compelling nonfiction proposals.
So if you're writing a memoir, a biography, or even like a work of investigative journalism, this book has something for you.
Exactly. They explain what agents and editors are looking for in a nonfiction proposal.
Okay.
And they emphasize the importance of crafting a narrative that engages the reader, just like you would in a novel.
So even if you're dealing with facts and real events, you still need that storytelling element.
Yes.
To make it captivating.
Absolutely. They stress the importance of a strong hook, a clear overview of the book's premise, and a compelling argument for why this story needs to be told. And they even provide a sample nonfiction proposal to show you how it's done.
That's incredibly helpful. Now, before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to touch on one more thing they emphasize throughout the book.
What's that?
It's the idea that there are no hard and fast rules when it comes to storytelling.
You're right. They encourage us to experiment, to find what works best for us, and to always be learning and growing as writers.
So it's about taking all this advice as a starting point.
Yeah.
But ultimately finding our own voice and our own style.
Exactly. And perhaps most importantly, they remind us to never give up, to keep writing, keep learning, and keep believing in the power of our stories.
That's incredibly inspiring. I don't know about you, but I'm feeling fired up and we're ready to tackle my next writing project. Me too. And I think we've given you a great foundation to do just that. Remember, the key takeaways from our deep dive into how to tell a story are to choose strong ideas, craft compelling characters, build dramatic structure, master pacing, and never underestimate the power of rewriting.
And most importantly, to never give up on the magic of storytelling.
Yes.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, happy writing.
Happy writing.
See you next time on the Facilitators Deep Dive podcast, your podcast on your way to facilitation mastery. Until next time.
See you then.